Hey everyone, welcome back, or welcome for the first time. If you're new here, either way, go ahead and settle in. Maybe dim the lights, get comfortable. Tonight we're drifting back about 800 years to explore something wonderfully mundane. What medieval Templar Knights actually ate. Because when you think of the Knights Templar, you probably picture dramatic battles, mysterious rituals, maybe some conspiracy theories about hidden treasure. But tonight, we're not doing any of that. Tonight, we're talking about their meal schedule, their dietary rules, the absolutely thrilling world of medieval monastic meal planning. Because nothing says elite warrior brotherhood quite like strict regulations about when you can eat chickens. So, the Templars, founded in 1119 because the Crusades were happening and someone decided that Jerusalem needed a group of monk knights to protect pilgrims. Which is a reasonable enough idea, except it led to the creation of an organization that became absurdly wealthy, politically powerful, and eventually so threatening to various kings that they got disbanded in the most dramatic way possible. But we'll get to that slow-motion disaster later. First, let's talk about lunch. The Templars lived by a rule, capital R, written down around 1129. This rule told them exactly how to behave, what to wear, when to pray, and most importantly for our purposes tonight, what to eat and when. Because if you're going to create a military order of monk warriors, you need to make sure they're not just out there eating whatever they want, whenever they want. That would be chaos. Delicious chaos, perhaps, but chaos nonetheless. According to the rule, Templars ate meat 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. The rest of the week, they were on a vegetarian diet, which sounds almost progressive until you remember this wasn't about health or animal welfare. This was about religious discipline and the idea that too much meat made men lustful, because medieval Christianity was deeply concerned about the connection between diet and sin. Meat, apparently, inflamed the passions, made men think impure thoughts. So if you wanted holy warriors, you had to limit their beef intake. Obviously, on meat days, the Templars would gather in their refectory, that's the dining hall, and eat communally. Everything was shared. Portions were distributed equally, because this was a brotherhood, and also because inequality at dinner would lead to resentment and possibly knife fights. The meat itself was usually mutton or pork, sometimes poultry, occasionally beef, if they were feeling fancy, or if someone had donated a cow. The meat would be boiled or roasted, served with bread, and accompanied by whatever vegetables were available: beans, lentils, cabbage, all the medieval greatest hits. But here's where it gets interesting. Well, as interesting as medieval dining regulations can get. The Templars weren't allowed to eat alone, ever. Even if you were stationed at some remote castle in the middle of nowhere, you had to eat with at least one other brother. This was partly about maintaining community bonds, and partly because eating alone was considered a sign of pride. And pride, as we all know, was a sin. So you had to share your meal, share your table, and presumably make awkward small talk about the weather or the latest Saracen raid while chewing your mutton. The meals were eaten in silence, mostly, or rather, someone would read aloud from religious texts while everyone else ate. Imagine that. You're a trained warrior. You've spent the morning practicing swordplay, or riding horses, or doing whatever medieval military training involved. You're hungry. You sit down to your twice-weekly portion of pork, and someone starts reading scripture at you. You can't chat with your friends. You can't complain about the food. You just have to sit there chewing quietly, listening to passages from the Bible or the lives of saints, trying not to think about how much you'd rather be eating literally anywhere else. On non-meat days, the diet got even more exciting. Fish was allowed, of course, because fish didn't count as meat. Medieval logic, something about fish being cold-blooded, made them less likely to inflame your passions, apparently. So on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, the Templars ate fish. Salted fish, dried fish, fresh fish if they were near water. Herring was popular. Cod, whatever could be caught or preserved, served with bread, vegetables, and the same thrilling mealtime readings. The bread, by the way, was serious business. Templars got a specific amount each day, about 2 pounds of bread per man. White bread for the knights, darker bread for the sergeants and lower-ranking members, because even in a supposedly equal brotherhood, there was still a hierarchy. The knights were noblemen, after all. They'd grown up eating fine wheat bread. You couldn't expect them to survive on the same rough barley loaves as the commoners. That would be unreasonable. Wine was provided with meals. Everyone got wine. Again, with specific quantities allocated by rank. The knights got more, naturally, and if someone complained that their wine had gone sour or their portion was too small, well, that was a sin. Greed. You were supposed to accept whatever was given to you with gratitude and humility, even if your wine tasted like vinegar and your neighbor somehow got twice as much. Character building. Breakfast wasn't really a thing, or rather, it existed, but it was minimal. A piece of bread, maybe some watered-down wine. The main meal was around midday, after morning prayers and work, then a lighter meal in the evening before bed. This was standard for most medieval monasteries, and the Templars, despite being warriors, were still technically monks. They followed monastic rhythms, up before dawn for prayers, work and training during the day, more prayers, meals at specific times, bed early, very structured, very disciplined, very, very repetitive, which sounds tedious, and it absolutely was, but that was kind of the point. The Templar life wasn't supposed to be comfortable or exciting. It was supposed to be a sacrifice. You gave up personal freedom, personal property, even personal meal choices, all in service to God and the protection of pilgrims. Your reward would come in heaven, presumably. Down here, you got boiled mutton 3 times a week and someone reading at you during dinner. Now, let's talk about the exceptions. Because there are always exceptions, and the exceptions are always more interesting than the rules. If a Templar was sick, he could request better food, white meat, like chicken, or softer bread. The infirmary had more relaxed dietary rules because, obviously, you can't nurse someone back to health on salted herring and religious guilt. So if you were genuinely ill, you might get to eat poultry more often, or have eggs, or even scandalously eat meat on a non-meat day. Some Templars, naturally, took advantage of this, claimed they were too weak to digest fish, complained of stomach ailments, anything to get access to that sweet, sweet chicken. The rule actually had to address this, warning against false claims of illness for the purpose of obtaining better food, which tells you that it was happening frequently enough to be a problem. Medieval food fraud, a tale as old as time. There were also feast days, saints' days, holy days, various celebrations throughout the year when the dietary restrictions were relaxed. On these occasions, the Templars might get to meat dishes instead of one, or special pastries, or extra wine. These were meant to be joyful occasions, moments of community celebration. Although, given that everything still had to be eaten in that same silent refectory while someone read scripture, one has to wonder how festive it really felt. The kitchens themselves were overseen by a brother specifically assigned to the task. The cook wasn't just any random Templar, it was a position of responsibility. He had to make sure meals were prepared on time, portions were fair, and nothing was wasted. Wasting food was a sin. If bread went stale, it was softened in water or used for something else. If meat started to turn, well, you cooked it longer and hoped for the best. Nothing went to waste if it could possibly be eaten. Efficiency and piety working hand in hand. Guests were another complication. The Templars frequently hosted visitors, pilgrims, nobles, church officials, other military orders. These guests had to be fed, and fed well, because hospitality was a Christian duty. But they couldn't just eat whatever they wanted either. The rule specified that guests should receive the same food as the brothers, or slightly better if they were of high rank, which meant the cook had to somehow calculate who deserved what level of meal, while still maintaining the appearance of humility and equality. Medieval HR nightmare. And then there were the servants. Because yes, despite being a military monastic order, the Templars had servants. Lots of them. They couldn't exactly cook and clean and maintain their vast properties by themselves. So they employed people. And those people also had to be fed, usually with the same food as the lower-ranking Templars, though probably in slightly smaller quantities and definitely without the white bread. Hierarchy all the way down. Let's drift over to what happened if you broke the food rules. Because of course people broke the food rules. Some Templar, somewhere, desperate for variety, or just having a bad day, would sneak extra food, hoard a piece of cheese, eat meat on a Wednesday. And when caught because someone was always watching, there were consequences. Penance, extra prayers, public confession, possibly a beating, depending on the severity and how annoyed the master was feeling that day. All for the crime of wanting a snack at an unapproved time. The traveling Templars had it slightly different. If you were on the road, either on pilgrimage protection duty or moving between commanderies, you couldn't exactly maintain the strict meal schedule. You ate when you could, what you could. The rule acknowledged this, giving some flexibility for brothers who were traveling. You could eat meat if nothing else was available. You could skip the communal aspect if you were alone. Practical concessions to reality. Although you were still expected to pray before meals and maintain some semblance of discipline, even if you were eating cold bread by the side of a dusty road somewhere in the Levant. In the eastern commanderies, the ones actually in the Holy Land, the diet was a bit different by necessity. Different climate, different available foods, more fruit, probably dates, figs, olives, things that grew more readily in that environment. Less emphasis on Northern European staples, but the basic structure remained the same. Meat 3 times a week, fish the other days, communal dining, silence, scripture readings, the comforting monotony of routine, even in a war zone. Which brings us to an interesting point. These men were warriors, elite fighters. They trained constantly with weapons. They went into battle. They faced death regularly. And yet their daily lives were governed by incredibly petty rules about when they could eat chicken. The contrast is almost funny. You could be the most skilled swordsman in Christendom, feared by enemies, respected by allies, and still get in trouble for eating an extra piece of bread. Glory and tedium, side by side. Now then, let us drift forward a few centuries and meet someone whose dietary concerns were somewhat more complicated than is it a meat day. Let's talk about Charles II of Spain, born 1661, died 1700, known to history as the Bewitched, though really, he should have been known as the inevitable result of way too much family intermarriage. Charles was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, and he was not well. Physically, mentally, genetically pick a category, and Charles struggled in it. Through no fault of his own, of course. He was simply the final product of generations of Habsburg dynastic policy, which can be summarized as keep the bloodline pure by marrying relatives, and surely nothing bad will happen. Spoiler alert, bad things happened. Charles's family tree did on so much branch as loop back on itself repeatedly, like a very concerning piece of string art. His father, Philip IV, had married Mariana of Austria, who was Philip's niece, his brother's daughter. So Charles's mother was also his cousin. This was not unusual for the Habsburgs. This was, in fact, standard operating procedure. They'd been doing this for generations, carefully wedding uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins, occasionally brothers-in-law to sisters-in-law, just to keep things interesting. The result was Charles, born after a difficult pregnancy to a mother who was already worried because she'd had several previous children die in infancy. Not a great start, and when Charles arrived, he was concerning, small, weak, with a jaw that jutted out so far it became his defining facial feature, the famous Habsburg jaw, taken to its absolute extreme. That jaw, by the way, wasn't just cosmetic. It was so pronounced that Charles couldn't chew properly, couldn't eat solid food well into childhood. His tongue was too large for his mouth, another genetic gift which meant he drooled constantly and had difficulty speaking clearly. People who met him had trouble understanding what he was saying. His own royal decrees had to be translated by courtiers who were better at interpreting his slurred speech. He also couldn't walk until he was about 8 years old. His legs were too weak, too malformed. He had to be carried everywhere as a child, and even when he finally managed to walk, he moved awkwardly, lurching from place to place. Running was out of the question. Dancing was impossible. All those elegant courtly activities that young princes were supposed to master. Charles couldn't do any of them. His health was a constant crisis. He had frequent digestive problems, probably related to that whole can't chew properly situation. He suffered from seizures. He was often feverish. His immune system was essentially decorative. Every minor illness became a major medical emergency because his body just couldn't cope with anything. The court physicians were in a constant state of panic, trying remedy after remedy, none of which worked because, well, you can't cure genetics with medieval medicine. And the poor child was watched constantly, examined, documented. Every cough, every fever, every digestive incident was recorded by anxious courtiers and doctors who knew that the entire Spanish Habsburg line depended on this one fragile boy surviving long enough to produce an heir. The pressure was immense, the stakes were existential, and Charles, for his part, just kept being sick. He was also not particularly bright, which is putting it gently. Charles was slow to learn, struggled with basic education, never quite grasped the complexities of statecraft or governance. His tutors did their best, but there's only so much you can do when your student is dealing with severe cognitive impairment caused by centuries of inbreeding. He could sign his name, he could sit through council meetings, but actually ruling, making decisions, understanding the political intricacies of running a global empire, that was beyond him, so other people ruled for him. His mother, initially serving as regent, then various courtiers and advisors who manipulated the king to their own ends. Charles was king in name, but in practice, he was a figurehead, a very sad, very sick figurehead, who just wanted to be left alone, but couldn't be because he was, unfortunately, the King of Spain, and someone had to at least pretend he was in charge. He married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who arrived in Spain expecting to be queen and instead found herself married to a man who could barely speak, could barely walk, and was constantly ill. By all accounts, she tried to make the best of it, was kind to Charles, but there were no children. Couldn't be. Charles was almost certainly infertile, another gift from his genetics. After Marie-Louise died, possibly of appendicitis, possibly of poison, depending on which conspiracy theory you prefer. Charles married again. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, another attempt to produce an heir, another failure. Maria Anna seems to have been less patient than Marie-Louise. She found Charles repulsive, which, fair enough. She spent much of her time trying to secure her own political influence, while avoiding her husband as much as possible. The marriage was, by all accounts, deeply unhappy for both parties. Charles himself seems to have been aware, at least dimly, that something was wrong with him. He was reportedly superstitious, believing he was cursed or bewitched, hence the nickname. He underwent various exorcisms, consulted mystics, prayed constantly for healing that never came. He was desperate for an heir, not because he particularly wanted children, but because everyone kept telling him the fate of the dynasty depended on it. The pressure to reproduce, combined with his obvious inability to do so, must have been psychologically devastating. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire was slowly collapsing around him. Territories were lost. The economy was struggling. Military defeats piled up. And Charles, poor Charles, presided over all of it, with no real understanding of what was happening or ability to do anything about it. He was the king of a declining superpower, completely unequipped for the role, unable to fulfill his most basic dynastic duty of producing an heir. His death, when it finally came in 1700, was almost a relief. He'd been sick his entire life. The end was long and painful, his body finally giving up after 39 years of barely functioning. He left no children, no direct heir, just a will that named a French prince as his successor, which immediately triggered the War of Spanish Succession, because of course it did. Even in death, Charles caused problems, though this time it really wasn't his fault. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree has confirmed what was probably obvious to anyone paying attention. Charles II was the product of an inbreeding coefficient higher than what you'd see in the average parent-child pairing. His genetic diversity was catastrophically low. He never had a chance. From birth, he was doomed by the accumulated genetic load of generations of Habsburg marriages, all those careful dynastic alliances, all that effort to keep the bloodline pure and keep territories in the family, led directly to a king who couldn't walk, couldn't eat, couldn't speak clearly, couldn't think clearly, and couldn't produce children. The Spanish Habsburgs' obsession with genetic purity had achieved exactly the opposite of what they intended. Instead of a strong, pure bloodline, they got Charles, a tragic figure who suffered constantly, ruled poorly, and ended his dynasty not with a bang but with a pathetic whimper. But let's rewind a bit, because Charles II wasn't even the most tragic member of his family. That honor arguably goes to his great-great-grandmother, Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad, which is a deeply unkind nickname. But medieval and early modern historians were not known for their sensitivity. Joanna was born in 1479, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Those Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones who funded Columbus and finished the Reconquista and expelled the Jews from Spain, powerful monarchs, successful rulers, and absolutely terrible parents. But we'll get to that. Joanna was the third child, not expected to inherit much of anything. Her older siblings were lined up for the crowns of Castile and Aragon. She was, essentially, diplomatic currency, a pretty, intelligent princess who could be married off to secure an alliance, and that's exactly what happened. At 16, she was shipped off to the Low Countries to marry Philip of Habsburg, Philip the Handsome, because of course he was called that. And here's where things started to go wrong, because Joanna, by all accounts, fell desperately in love with her husband, completely, obsessively in love, which would be romantic, except Philip was, well, he was handsome, yes, charming, certainly, faithful, absolutely not. He had mistresses, many mistresses, he flaunted them, and Joanna, who loved him with an intensity that was probably not entirely healthy even by medieval standards, was devastated. She became jealous, intensely, ragefully jealous. There are accounts of her attacking one of Philip's mistresses with scissors, trying to cut off the woman's hair. She would fly into screaming rages when she found out about his affairs. She became possessive, controlling, desperate for his attention and affection. And Philip, for his part, seems to have found this both annoying and useful. He could manipulate her emotional state to his advantage while continuing to do exactly as he pleased. They had 6 children together. 6. So clearly they were spending at least some time together. But the marriage was turbulent, volatile, deeply dysfunctional. And then Joanna's siblings started dying. Her older brother Juan died in 1497. Then her sister Isabella died in childbirth in 1498. Then Isabella's son died in 1500. Suddenly, unexpectedly, Joanna was heir to Castile and Aragon. She was going to be queen. She, the jealous, emotionally unstable third child, was going to inherit one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Her parents were concerned. Ferdinand and Isabella had spent decades building their power. They had unified Spain. They'd established a strong monarchy. And now it was going to pass to their daughter, who spent most of her time having screaming matches with her unfaithful husband. This was not ideal. So they started questioning Joanna's fitness to rule. Started suggesting she might not be mentally sound. Started laying the groundwork for what would become decades of declaring their own daughter insane. In 1504, Isabella died. Joanna was now Queen of Castile. In theory, in practice, everyone immediately began scheming to control her. Her father Ferdinand wanted to rule as regent. Her husband Philip wanted to be king in his own right. And Joanna, caught in the middle, was told repeatedly by everyone around her that she was mad, unstable, unfit to rule. A campaign of gaslighting that would have been impressive if it weren't so cruel. Philip and Joanna returned to Spain in 1506 to claim the throne. There was a power struggle with Ferdinand, political maneuvering, treaties signed and broken, and then, suddenly, Philip died. September 1506, he was 28, probably typhoid fever, though of course there were rumors of poison because there are always rumors of poison, and Joanna did not take it well. which is understandable. Her husband, the man she'd loved obsessively despite his infidelities, the father of her children, was dead. She refused to be separated from his corpse, had the coffin opened repeatedly to look at his body, traveled with his coffin from place to place, unable to bury him, unable to let go. At one point, she kept the coffin in her room for months. She was pregnant at the time with their last child, grieving intensely, and everyone around her was documenting her behavior as evidence of insanity. Was she mad? Or was she a grieving widow going through a mental health crisis while simultaneously being manipulated by every powerful man around her? Hard to say, probably both. The grief seems to have genuinely broken something in her. But the narrative of her insanity was also extremely convenient for everyone who wanted to rule in her place. Ferdinand certainly thought it was convenient. He declared Joanna unfit to rule, took over as regent, and had her confined to the royal palace at Tordesillas. Just locked her up. She was queen. She was the legitimate ruler. But her father decided she couldn't be trusted with power, so he imprisoned her. For her own good, naturally. For the good of the kingdom. All very reasonable, and not at all a calculated political move. She spent the rest of her life there, 46 years, locked in Tordesillas. Her father ruled in her name until his death. Then her son Charles, yes, that Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, took over and continued to keep his mother imprisoned. She was allowed to see her youngest daughter, Catalina, who was confined with her. She was given servants, comfortable rooms, everything except freedom. She was queen, and she was a prisoner. The reports from Tordesillas are grim. Joanna refused to change her clothes, refused to bathe, sometimes would have violent episodes, refused to attend Mass or take communion for years at a stretch. Self-neglect and religious refusal that were taken as further proof of her madness. But she'd also been locked up for decades by her own family, denied any power or agency, kept in the same building year after year after year. That might drive anyone to stop caring about personal hygiene or religious observance. There were occasional attempts to free her. During the Comuneros revolt of 1522-1521, rebels tried to use Joanna as a figurehead against her son Charles. They went to Tordesillas, spoke to her, tried to get her to sign documents. But Joanna, after decades of confinement, was either too broken or too clever to cooperate. She refused to sign anything, refused to explicitly support the rebels. Maybe she'd learned that any political action would be used against her. Maybe she genuinely didn't understand what was happening. Maybe she just didn't care anymore. The revolt was crushed. Charles maintained control, and Joanna went back to being a forgotten prisoner. She lived until 1555, 75 years old. She'd been queen for over 50 years and had ruled for exactly none of them. Her father had imprisoned her. Her son had kept her imprisoned, and history remembered her as Joanna the Mad, the crazy queen who couldn't be trusted, rather than Joanna the convenient political prisoner. Modern historians debate whether she was actually insane or just inconvenient. The evidence is mixed. She clearly had mental health issues, particularly after Philip's death. The obsessive grief, the refusal to bury him, the emotional volatility, those were real. But the extent of her madness was almost certainly exaggerated by people who benefited from declaring her incompetent. And even if she was mentally ill, the treatment she received, decades of imprisonment, isolation, being stripped of all agency, would have made anyone worse. Her children, meanwhile, went on to rule vast territories. Her son Charles became Holy Roman Emperor, ruling over Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, the Americas. Her daughter Catherine became Queen of Portugal. Her daughter Eleanor became Queen of France. They all achieved things, had lives, made history, and their mother sat in Tordesillas, watching the years pass. Queen in name only. It's a deeply sad story, made sadder by the fact that nobody really tried to help her. Her husband had used her. Her father had imprisoned her. Her son had kept her imprisoned. The people around her documented her breakdown for political purposes, rather than attempting any kind of care or treatment. She was more useful to them as a mad queen who needed to be controlled than as a person who needed support. And here's the thing. Joanna's genes went on to create the rest of the Spanish Habsburg line. Her son Charles V, her grandson Philip II, all the way down to Charles II, the final product of the dynasty she began. That obsessive, intense personality she had, the jealousy, the emotional volatility, those traits got passed down, mixed with increasing amounts of inbreeding, creating generation after generation of Habsburgs with mental health issues, physical problems, and an inability to cope with the pressures of ruling. So when we talk about Charles II being the inevitable result of Habsburg genetics, we have to remember that it started with Joanna, the imprisoned queen, the woman who loved too intensely, grieved too publicly, and paid for it with 50 years in confinement. Her legacy wasn't just the dynasty she founded, it was also the proof that maybe, just maybe, trapping people in loveless or dysfunctional marriages for political gain and then being surprised when they develop mental health issues was not the best system. Let's drift forward again. Different country this time. France, late 18th century. Not expected to be king, his older brother, Louis Joseph, was the heir. But Louis Joseph was sickly, had tuberculosis of the spine, and died in 1789 at age 7, which meant little Louis Charles, age 4, suddenly became heir to the French throne, right as France was descending into revolutionary chaos. Timing could not have been worse. For his first few years, Louis Charles had a fairly normal royal childhood, spoiled, certainly, pampered, dressed in elaborate outfits, given toy soldiers and miniature fortresses to play with. He was reportedly a cheerful child, energetic, a bit headstrong. Marie Antoinette adored him, perhaps even more than she'd loved her older son. He was healthy, lively, everything a royal heir should be, and then everything fell apart. The revolution started in 1789. The royal family was forced to leave Versailles, moved to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, still comfortable, still royal, but now essentially prisoners. The mob controlled Paris, the king's authority was evaporating, and Louis Charles, too young to fully understand what was happening, watched his world slowly collapse. His parents became increasingly stressed, the servants disappeared or were dismissed. The palace became less a home and more a gilded cage. In 1791, the family tried to escape. The famous flight to Varennes. They got as far as a small town near the border before being recognized, stopped, and dragged back to Paris. Louis Charles was 6. He'd been woken in the middle of the night, bundled into a carriage, driven for hours, and then watched his parents be humiliated and arrested. Not exactly trauma-free. Back in Paris, things got worse. The king's power was officially ended. The family was moved to the Temple, a medieval fortress converted into a prison. No more palace, no more servants, just a few rooms in a tower, guarded by revolutionaries who hated everything they represented. Louis Charles went from being a prince with every luxury to being a prisoner with almost nothing, and he was 7 years old. For a while, the family stayed together. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Louis Charles, his older sister, Marie Thérèse, and his aunt Madame Elizabeth. They tried to maintain some normalcy. Lessons for the children, meals together. But the guards were cruel. The conditions were harsh, and Louis Charles could hear the crowds outside shouting for his parents' deaths, could hear the guards insulting his mother, could feel the fear and despair in the room. In December 1792, Louis XVI was put on trial. Louis Charles was 8. His father was taken away, and the boy never saw him again. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. Louis Charles was now, technically, Louis XVII, King of France, except France didn't have a monarchy anymore, and wouldn't have been interested in a child king if it did. He was a king without a kingdom, a prisoner in a tower, recently traumatized by his father's execution. Marie Antoinette tried to comfort him, tried to keep his spirits up, but she was drowning in her own grief and terror, knowing she'd be next. And she was. In July 1793, the revolutionaries took Louis Charles away from his mother, just removed him, separated him from the only parent he had left, from his sister, from his aunt. They gave him to a guardian. And Simon did this through a combination of neglect, verbal abuse, and forced behavior. He made Louis Charles wear the clothes of a common street child, made him drink alcohol, taught him revolutionary songs filled with obscene lyrics, encouraged him to curse, to be violent, to forget his manners and education. The boy was 8 years old. He had just lost his father and been torn from his mother, and now he was being systematically degraded by an adult who mocked him constantly, who praised him only when he behaved in ways that would have horrified his parents, who was actively trying to destroy his sense of self. It was, by any measure, child abuse, deliberate, calculated psychological torture disguised as political education. Simon also forced Louis Charles to testify against his mother. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was put on trial. Among the charges added at the last minute to make her seem more monstrous was sexual abuse of her son. Simon had coached Louis Charles to say that his mother had engaged in inappropriate behavior with him. The boy, broken and confused and desperate for any approval from his captor, said what he was told to say. It's unlikely Marie Antoinette ever even heard the full accusation. The trial was a farce anyway. She was going to be executed regardless of what charges were brought. But the fact that her own son, manipulated and abused, had been used as a weapon against her in her final days is one of the cruelest details in an already cruel story. She was guillotined on October 16, 1793. Louis Charles was now completely alone. Both parents dead, sister and aunt imprisoned elsewhere. Just him and his abuser. Simon left after a few months. Mission accomplished, presumably. He'd broken the boy. But Louis Charles wasn't released. Instead, he was locked in a small room in the temple, alone, completely alone. The revolutionaries couldn't decide what to do with him, couldn't kill a child, probably couldn't release him. He was a symbol of the old monarchy, so they just locked him up and forgot about him. The room was dark, small, windows too high to see out of. He had a bed, a chamber pot, very little else. Food was passed through a door. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody checked on his well-being. He was 9 years old, and he spent months, possibly over a year, in solitary confinement, alone in the dark, with nothing to do, nobody to talk to, no care or human contact beyond the minimum required to keep him technically alive. The records from this period are sparse. The guards occasionally noted that he was alive. That's about it. They didn't clean his room, didn't let him bathe, didn't give him clean clothes. The conditions became filthy. The boy became filthy. He developed scabies, rickets, malnutrition, tuberculosis. His body began to break down from neglect. When officials finally checked on him properly in 1795, they were horrified. He was skeletal, covered in sores. His hair was filthy and matted. He couldn't walk properly. His legs had become deformed from rickets and lack of movement. He could barely speak. Whether from trauma, isolation, or physical illness, he'd essentially stopped communicating. He was 10 years old and dying from prolonged child abuse. They tried to help, belatedly, brought in doctors, cleaned him up, gave him better food, but it was too late. The damage was done. His body was too weak. On June 8, 1795, Louis Charles died, aged 10. Cause of death was officially tuberculosis, though really it was everything. Neglect, abuse, starvation, disease, isolation, the accumulated effects of 2 years of systematic cruelty. His sister Marie Therese survived. She was released in 1795, the only member of her immediate family to make it out alive. She was 17 and had spent 3 years in prison. She never fully recovered from the trauma, never spoke much about her time in the temple. She'd lost her entire family, her parents, her aunt, her brother, and her brother's death was perhaps the most senseless. He'd been a child, no threat to anyone, and they'd tortured him anyway, through neglect and isolation, until he died. There were conspiracy theories, of course, claims that Louis Charles had been smuggled out and replaced with another child, that he'd survived and escaped. Pretenders appeared throughout the 19th century, claiming to be the lost Dauphin. DNA testing in 2000 finally confirmed that the heart preserved from the autopsy was indeed Louis Charles's. He'd died in that tower. There was no escape, no happy ending. Just a 10-year-old boy destroyed by adults who couldn't figure out what else to do with him. The story of Louis XVII is a reminder that royal birth is not a shield against suffering. If anything, it can make things worse. This child's main crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. He went from prince to prisoner to corpse in less than a decade, never had a chance to grow up, never got to choose his own path, just suffered until he didn't anymore. Let's stay in France but drift backward to the 14th century. Time to talk about Isabella of Valois, a princess who was married off at age 6 to Richard II of England, because medieval politics required a peace treaty between England and France, and apparently the best way to seal that treaty was to betroth a grown man to a literal child. Isabella was born in 1389, daughter of Charles VI of France, who was himself deeply unwell. Charles VI would later be known as Charles the Mad, because he had recurring episodes of psychosis where he forgot who he was, believed he was made of glass, attacked his own men, and generally couldn't function. So Isabella's father was unstable. Her childhood was probably already complicated, and then, in 1396, she was told she was getting married. She was 7 at this point. Richard II was 29. Let that age gap sink in for a moment. 29 and 7. This was not unusual for medieval royal marriages. Child betrothals happened constantly, but usually there was at least a pretense that the marriage wouldn't be consummated until the girl was older. Usually Richard desperately wanted peace with France. England and France had been fighting the 100 Years' War on and off for decades. A royal marriage could secure a truce, and Isabella, as daughter of the French king, was valuable diplomatic currency. So the marriage was arranged. A massive, expensive wedding ceremony was held. Isabella, dressed in elaborate adult clothes she could barely move in, was married to a man she'd never met. To Richard's credit, and there's not much credit to give him. Honestly, he apparently didn't treat her as a wife in any physical sense. She was too young. He wasn't a monster. He kept her at Windsor Castle, gave her a household, and essentially just waited for her to grow up, which must have been incredibly awkward for everyone involved. She was Queen of England but still playing with dolls. Isabella's household was filled with French attendants sent to keep her company and report back to France about how she was being treated. She learned English slowly, saw her husband occasionally, lived in luxury but must have been lonely and confused. She'd been taken from her family, from everything familiar, and transplanted to a foreign country where she was queen but not really, too young to rule, too young to fulfill any actual queenly duties. Just a child in a castle, waiting to grow up enough to matter. And then everything went wrong. Again, because in 1399, when Isabella was 10, Richard II was deposed, overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned and died shortly afterward, probably murdered, probably starved, definitely not a natural death. And Isabella, suddenly, was the widow of a deposed and dead king. At age 10, her marriage had lasted 3 years and achieved nothing except making her a political liability. Henry IV didn't know what to do with her. She was still technically Queen of England, but England had a new king now and Henry had his own wife. Isabella couldn't stay queen, but she couldn't just be released. Either she was French royalty, and sending her back to France without careful negotiation might cause diplomatic problems. So she was kept at various castles, not quite a prisoner, but not quite free either, while England and France argued about what to do with her. This went on for years. Isabella was moved from castle to castle. Her household was reduced to fewer servants, less luxury. She was still treated well, presumably, but she was in limbo, a deposed child queen with no clear future. France wanted her back, and wanted her substantial dowry back to England. Didn't want to return the dowry, but also didn't really want to keep Isabella. Negotiations dragged on. Finally, in 1401, Isabella was returned to France. She was 12. She'd spent 5 years as Queen of England and had nothing to show for it except trauma and fluency in English. She went back to her father's court, back to her mother, back to a country that was now more familiar, but still strange after years away. She'd left as a child bride. She returned as a child widow. Her father, Charles VI, was having one of his better periods when she returned. He was lucid enough to be glad to see her, at least. But the French court was full of intrigue and political factions. Isabella's mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was having affairs and accumulating power. The country was being fought over by various dukes and princes. It was not a stable or safe environment. But at least Isabella was back with her family. And then, because apparently Isabella's life needed more trauma, she was told she'd be getting married again, age 13. She'd barely recovered from her first disastrous marriage, and already she was being offered up for another diplomatic alliance, this time to her cousin, Charles of Orleans, a poet, apparently sensitive, only 8 years older than her, which by medieval royal marriage standards was practically age-appropriate. The marriage happened in 1406. Isabella was 14. This time at least, she was old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to have opinions about her own life, not that anyone particularly cared what those opinions were. She was married, again to a man she barely knew, for political reasons that had nothing to do with her well-being or happiness, and then, shockingly, she died in childbirth, 1409. Age 19. She'd been pregnant with her first child, finally old enough to actually consummate a marriage and produce the required heir. The baby was born, a daughter, but something went wrong. Infection, hemorrhage, complications medieval medicine couldn't tell you specifically, and medieval medicine definitely couldn't fix it. Isabella died, 19 years old. She'd been married twice, widowed once, exiled, returned, and finally killed by the one thing she'd been groomed her entire life to do, produce children. Her daughter survived, grew up, married, had her own children. The genetic line continued, which was probably all anyone cared about. But Isabella herself was gone. 19 years of life, most of them spent being shuffled around as a political pawn. Married at 7 to a man 22 years older, widowed at 10, remarried at 14. Dead at 19, never got to make a single significant choice about her own life. Her second husband, Charles of Orleans, survived her by many years. He wrote poetry about grief and loss, some of which might have been about Isabella, though he remarried afterward, so who knows. He got to have a life, got to grow old, got to write beautiful verses about his feelings. Isabella got to die in childbirth as a teenager. The tragedy of Isabella's story isn't just that she died young. Lots of people died young in medieval Europe. The tragedy is that her entire life was designed and controlled by others. She never had agency, never had choice, was married to one king, widowed, shuffled around like unwanted furniture, married to another man, and then killed by pregnancy before she was 20. Her whole existence was in service to diplomatic treaties and dynastic alliances. She was valuable as a symbol, as a womb, as a peace offering, never as a person. And this was normal. This was expected. Noble daughters were raised, knowing they'd be married off for political advantage, that their wishes didn't matter, that their value lay in their ability to cement alliances and produce heirs. Isabella's story is only remarkable because it was so particularly tragic. Most women in her position didn't get married at 7 to a man who then got deposed and murdered. Most didn't have quite that much concentrated misfortune, but the underlying system treating women as diplomatic currency, that was universal. Now let's fast forward to the 19th century, Germany, Bavaria, specifically. Time to talk about Ludwig II, also known as Mad King. Ludwig, though honestly he wasn't so much mad as just profoundly disinterested in the actual work of being king, and far more interested in building increasingly elaborate fantasy castles and obsessing over Richard Wagner's operas. Ludwig was born in 1845, son of Maximilian II of Bavaria. He grew up in castles, obviously, surrounded by art and music and romantic literature. His parents were not close. His father was serious and dutiful. His mother was distant and cold. Ludwig's childhood was lonely, formal, and filled with strict tutors and rigid schedules. He was sensitive, artistic, imaginative, all traits that were actively discouraged in a future king. He was supposed to be learning statecraft and military strategy, not daydreaming about medieval legends and operatic drama. But Ludwig loved beauty, loved art, loved theatre and music and architecture. He was obsessed with the operas of Richard Wagner, the epic, mythological, absurdly overwrought musical dramas that went on for hours and featured Norse gods and doomed love and dramatic deaths. To Ludwig, Wagner's operas were perfect. They combined music, storytelling, spectacle, everything he loved. He became Wagner's patron, gave him money, supported his work, and basically bankrolled the composer's career. Wagner, for his part, was happy to take Ludwig's money and mostly tolerated the young king's intense, arguably romantic obsession with him. Ludwig wrote letters to Wagner that were fervent, passionate, arguably inappropriate. Whether Ludwig was in love with Wagner or just in love with the idea of Wagner as an artistic genius is debated, probably both. Wagner was married and didn't return Ludwig's feelings, but he certainly didn't turn down the royal funding. In 1864, age 18, Ludwig became king. His father had died. Ludwig was now responsible for Bavaria, a medium-sized German state that was trying to maintain independence while being caught between Prussia and Austria. This required political skill, diplomatic maneuvering, and attention to administrative details. Ludwig had none of these qualities and no interest in acquiring them. He'd rather be attending operas or sketching designs for castles, so he delegated, had ministers run the government while he focused on his real passions. Building. Ludwig wanted to create fairy tale castles, perfect, beautiful, theatrical buildings that would be like stage sets from Wagner's operas brought to life. He started with Neuschwanstein, his most famous project, a castle on a mountaintop, designed to look like something from a medieval romance. Towers, turrets, elaborate interiors, throne rooms that were never used because Ludwig preferred to live alone. The castle was absurdly expensive, drained the treasury, took decades to build, and wasn't even finished when Ludwig died. But Ludwig didn't care. He wanted beauty, wanted perfection, wanted to create spaces that matched the grand, mythological, romantic visions in his head. Reality budgets, politics, public opinion was irrelevant. He was king. He could do what he wanted, and what he wanted was to build castles and ignore everything else. He also built Linderhof, a smaller palace based on Versailles, then Herrenchiemsee, an even larger palace explicitly modeled on Versailles because Ludwig was obsessed with Louis XIV and the idea of absolute monarchy. Never mind that absolute monarchy was outdated and Bavaria was a constitutional state. Ludwig wanted to pretend he was the Sun King, so he built himself a palace where he could live out that fantasy. He barely used any of these buildings, would visit, stay for a few days, then leave. The castles were stage sets for an audience of one. He'd have elaborate dinners prepared for himself alone, served by silent servants, while he pretended to be hosting grand court ceremonies. He'd wander the rooms at night, imagining he was Louis XIV or a Wagnerian hero. It was elaborate, expensive role-playing, funded by the Bavarian state budget. Meanwhile, actual governance was being neglected. Bavaria was caught up in the wars of German unification. Prussia was consolidating power. Ludwig was supposed to be making decisions about alliances, military treaties, constitutional reforms. Instead, he was obsessing over interior decoration and commissioning more elaborate throne rooms. His ministers were frustrated, the public was confused, and Ludwig just didn't care. Being king was boring. Building castles was interesting. He also became increasingly reclusive, avoided public appearances, would only meet with ministers and servants at night, sleeping during the day. He gained weight stress eating, probably, and became self-conscious about his appearance, which made him even less willing to be seen in public. He took long, solitary night rides through the countryside, disappeared into his castles for weeks at a time, refused to engage with the political crises happening around him. There were rumors about his personal life. He had a brief engagement to a Bavarian princess, his cousin, naturally, but broke it off before the wedding. Never married, never had children, almost certainly had no interest in women romantically. His letters to Wagner and to various male servants and friends suggest he was attracted to men, though he probably never acted on it. This was the 19th century. Homosexuality was illegal. He was king. He couldn't afford scandal, so he remained alone, isolated, surrounded by servants but without genuine companionship. By the 1880s, Bavaria's finances were a disaster. Ludwig had spent millions on his building projects. The state was deeply in debt. His ministers were panicking. The public was losing patience, and Ludwig just kept commissioning more elaborate plans. He wanted to build more castles, a Chinese palace, maybe, or a Byzantine hall. Money was no object in his mind because reality, again, was irrelevant. His ministers decided something had to be done. In 1886, they commissioned medical reports, declaring Ludwig insane. They used his eccentricity, his reclusiveness, his spending, his refusal to engage with governance, all evidence of madness. They found doctors willing to diagnose him without actually examining him, and on this basis, they declared him unfit to rule and moved to depose him. Ludwig was arrested at Neuschwanstein, taken to Burg Castle on Lake Starnberg, placed under medical supervision. He was 40 years old and being forcibly removed from power by his own government. The diagnosis was paranoia, which seems to have meant refuses to do what we want and spends too much money. He was held at Berg under guard, not imprisoned, exactly, but not free either. 2 days later, Ludwig was found dead, June 13, 1886, drowned in Lake Starnberg. His psychiatrist, who'd been walking with him, was also drowned. The official explanation was suicide. Ludwig walked into the lake and drowned himself. His doctor tried to stop him and drowned too. Very neat, very convenient, except it made no sense. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. The water where he was found was shallow, barely waist deep. His autopsy showed no water in his lungs, suggesting he didn't actually drown, and his doctor had been hit on the head. It looked, to many people, like murder, like the government had decided Ludwig was too problematic, too expensive, too embarrassing, and had him killed. Made it look like suicide or an accident. Problem solved. We'll never know for certain what happened. The official records are contradictory. The witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Ludwig's body showed evidence that contradicted the drowning narrative, but he was declared to have drowned. His brother took over as king, and Bavaria moved on. The embarrassing, expensive, reclusive king was gone. The castles remained, half-finished, draining the treasury for decades after his death. Ludwig never married, never had children, never really ruled in any meaningful way. He spent his kingship building elaborate fantasies and avoiding reality. He was lonely, isolated, probably deeply closeted, unable to be the person he wanted to be or live the life he might have chosen. So he built castles instead, created beautiful, empty spaces where he could pretend to be someone else. And when he became too inconvenient, too expensive, too eccentric, he died under suspicious circumstances and was remembered as Mad King Ludwig. Though really, maybe he wasn't mad. Maybe he was just a sensitive, artistic, queer man born into a role he never wanted and could never fulfill. Forced to be king when he wanted to be a patron of the arts. Expected to marry and produce heirs when he had no interest in women. required to engage with politics and warfare when he wanted to listen to Wagner and design throne rooms. He failed at being king, but he succeeded at building some of the most beautiful, impractical buildings in Europe, which is something. Let's drift back a century or so and talk about something specific and awful. Dental surgery in the 17th century. Specifically, the dental surgery experienced by Henrietta Maria of France, Queen Consort of Charles I of England, because sometimes royal life wasn't about grand political dramas. Sometimes it was about having your face mutilated by incompetent doctors. Henrietta Maria was born in 1609, youngest daughter of Henry IV of France. She married Charles I of England in 1625, age 15, which was actually pretty typical for royal marriages. The marriage was politically motivated. England wanted a French alliance, and it started badly. Charles was Protestant. Henrietta was Catholic. This was a problem in 17th century England, where Catholics were viewed with suspicion and hatred. So Henrietta arrived in England already unpopular, already viewed as a foreign threat. She and Charles eventually developed genuine affection for each other, which was nice, rare even, for arranged royal marriages. They had 9 children. She was involved in court life, supported artists and musicians, seemed to be managing the impossible job of being a Catholic queen in Protestant England reasonably well. And then her teeth continue 741 started causing problems. Dental problems were common in the 17th century. No real understanding of oral hygiene, no proper treatments. People's teeth rotted, caused infections, caused pain that could last for months or years. And for someone in Henrietta's position, there was the added complication that she needed to maintain a public image, couldn't be seen with rotting teeth or swollen abscesses, had to look queenly and dignified, even when in constant pain. At some point in the 1640s, sources aren't entirely clear on the exact date, Henrietta developed a serious dental abscess, probably from an infected tooth. The infection spread, her face swelled, the pain was apparently excruciating, and the doctors decided they needed to operate. Now, 17th century medical understanding was limited. They knew abscesses were bad, knew infection could kill, but their solutions were crude. Surgery meant cutting into the patient while they were fully conscious, because effective anesthesia didn't exist yet. The best you might get was alcohol or opium to dull the pain slightly, and then they'd start cutting. In Henrietta's case, the doctors decided they needed to drain the abscess, which meant cutting into her face, into her gums, into her jaw, trying to reach the infection. She was held down probably by several strong men while surgeons worked on her face with crude instruments. No sterilization, no precision, just cutting and hoping they found and drained the abscess before she died of blood loss or shock or screaming. The surgery was, by all accounts, a nightmare. Contemporary sources describe Henrietta's suffering in ways that are genuinely hard to read. The pain was so severe she couldn't speak for days afterward. Her face was mutilated, scarred, swollen beyond recognition, and the worst part, the surgery didn't fully work. The infection persisted. They'd cut into her face, traumatized her, permanently disfigured her, and she was still sick. She recovered eventually. Sort of. The infection cleared, probably more from luck than medical intervention. Her face healed, though she was left with visible scars, and she had to continue living her public life, attending court functions, being queen, while dealing with both the physical aftermath and the psychological trauma of having been held down and having her face cut open while conscious. This wasn't even her only medical trauma. She had difficult pregnancies, 9 children born, but several died in infancy or childhood. She suffered from various other ailments throughout her life, all treated with equally primitive and brutal medical interventions. Bloodletting, purging, medications made from toxic substances. Every attempt to help probably made things worse. And all of this happened while England was descending into civil war. Charles I versus Parliament, religious conflicts, political instability. Henrietta was Catholic, politically active, and blamed by many for influencing the king toward absolutism and religious tolerance. She was hated, called a foreign agent, accused of plotting against England, and she had to navigate all of this while recovering from facial surgery and dealing with chronic pain. The Civil War went badly for the Royalists. Charles I was eventually captured, put on trial, and executed in 1649. Henrietta was in France by then. She fled England during the war to avoid capture. She watched from abroad as her husband was beheaded, as her children were scattered and some imprisoned, as everything she'd built in England was destroyed. She lived in exile in France, dependent on the charity of her nephew Louis XIV for the rest of her life. She died in 1669, age 59. She'd survived brutal medical procedures, multiple difficult pregnancies, exile, civil war, and the execution of her husband. She'd lived through trauma after trauma, and she's mostly remembered now as the Catholic queen who supposedly influenced Charles I toward tyranny. Her suffering, the physical pain, the medical brutality, the loss and exile of that gets forgotten in favor of her political legacy. But here's what's worth remembering. Henrietta Maria spent years in chronic pain from dental problems, was subjected to surgery that would be considered torture by modern standards, was mutilated and scarred, all in an attempt to relieve infection, and she had to continue being queen through all of it, had to maintain dignity and composure while her face was swollen and scarred, had to participate in public life while dealing with pain and trauma that would have incapacitated most people. The brutality of pre-modern medicine is hard to conceptualize. We're so used to anesthesia, antibiotics, sterilization, used to the idea that medical treatment, even when painful, will probably help more than it hurts. But for someone like Henrietta, medical treatment was just another form of suffering. The doctors meant well, probably. They were trying to save her life, but their methods were barbaric because they didn't know any better, and she had to endure it all while maintaining her role as queen. Let's move forward to the 19th century again. Germany, 1888. Time to talk about Frederick III, who had perhaps the most pointless reign of any German emperor. He waited his entire life to become Kaiser, finally achieved it at age 56, and then died 99 days later of throat cancer, barely 3 months on the throne. Just long enough to matter, but not long enough to actually do anything. Frederick was born in 1831, son of Wilhelm I of Prussia, raised to be king eventually, but his father lived until he was 90. So, Frederick spent decades as crown prince, waiting, watching, developing his own political ideas that differed significantly from his father's conservative views. Frederick was a liberal, relatively speaking, believed in constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, progressive reforms. He admired Britain, where his wife Victoria, daughter of Queen Victoria, came from. He wanted Prussia, and eventually Germany, to be more like Britain, less militaristic, more democratic, but he couldn't do anything about it. He was crown prince. His father was Kaiser. His father's chancellor was Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who ran Germany with an iron fist and had no interest in Frederick's liberal ideas. So Frederick waited, and waited, for decades, growing older, watching Bismarck consolidate power, knowing that when he finally became Kaiser, he'd be able to change things, make Germany better, more free, more progressive. Except then he got sick. In 1887, age 55, Frederick developed a persistent cough, a hoarseness in his voice that wouldn't go away. His doctors examined him and found a growth on his vocal cords, probably cancer, probably fatal. They recommended surgery removing the larynx entirely, which would save his life but leave him unable to speak. Frederick refused. He was crown prince. His father was old and wouldn't live much longer. Frederick needed to be able to speak, to communicate, to rule. He couldn't be Kaiser without a voice. So he sought second opinions, found doctors who said maybe it wasn't cancer. Maybe it was something benign that could be treated less invasively. He traveled to Britain for treatment, underwent various procedures, none of which worked. The growth persisted, his voice deteriorated, and his father, Wilhelm I, continued to live, apparently sustained by pure Prussian stubbornness. Finally, in March 1888, Wilhelm I died, aged 90. Frederick was now Kaiser Frederick III. At last, after 56 years of waiting, and he was dying. Throat cancer, confirmed now beyond doubt, unable to speak clearly, in constant pain, with maybe months to live if he was lucky. He tried to rule anyway, tried to implement reforms, but he couldn't speak, had to communicate by writing notes, and Bismarck, the Chancellor, was still there. Tried to support her husband's reforms and push back against Bismarck, but she was British, foreign, distrusted by the German public and court. Her interventions made things worse, gave Bismarck ammunition to claim that Frederick was being controlled by foreign influences, that his illness made him unfit to rule, that Germany needed strong leadership, not a dying liberal and his foreign wife. Frederick lasted 99 days. March 9th to June 15th, 1888, 3 months of increasingly desperate attempts to communicate, to govern, to make some kind of lasting change. But he was too sick, too weak, Bismarck too powerful, and the German system too resistant to sudden reform. Everything Frederick had wanted to do, all the plans he'd made during decades as Crown Prince, came to nothing. He died at age 56, throat cancer. His son Wilhelm II became Kaiser. Wilhelm II, who was nothing like his father. Wilhelm was militaristic, aggressive, impulsive. He dismissed Bismarck a few years later, yes, but then proceeded to drive Germany toward World War I with his erratic foreign policy and obsession with military power. Everything Frederick had feared, everything he'd wanted to prevent. And the really cruel part, if Frederick had accepted the surgery in 1887, had his larynx removed, lost his voice, he probably would have lived, would have become Kaiser, mute but alive, could have communicated through writing, could have implemented at least some reforms. But he refused, because he thought he needed his voice to rule, thought he couldn't be Kaiser without being able to speak. And that decision, that very human desire to maintain his voice and dignity, may have cost Germany and Europe the chance for a less militaristic, less aggressive German empire. Or maybe not. Maybe Bismarck and the conservative military establishment were too powerful. Maybe Frederick, even healthy, couldn't have changed Germany's trajectory. Maybe World War I was inevitable regardless. But we'll never know. Because Frederick died 3 months after becoming Kaiser, and his son Wilhelm II took over and drove the empire toward disaster. Frederick's wife, Victoria, outlived him by over a decade, lived in retirement, bitter and frustrated. She'd supported her husband's liberal vision, had hoped to see Germany reformed. Instead, she watched her son Wilhelm embrace everything she and Frederick had opposed. She died in 1901, largely forgotten. Her husband's brief reign barely remembered, except as a curiosity. The 99-day Kaiser, the liberal who never got his chance. Let's circle back to personal habits now. Specifically, let's talk about King James I of England and his absolute refusal to engage in anything resembling personal hygiene. Because sometimes, being royal meant you could smell terrible, and nobody was allowed to tell you. James was born in 1566 in Scotland. Became King James VI of Scotland as an infant, after his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate. Raised by a series of regents and tutors, had a traumatic childhood full of political instability, kidnappings, and general chaos, and somewhere along the way, developed some interesting ideas about bathing, specifically, that he didn't need to do it. Now, to be fair, regular bathing wasn't universal in the 16th and 17th centuries. Medical theory suggested that water could allow disease to enter through the pores, that washing too much was dangerous. So many people didn't bathe frequently, but James took this to an extreme. He reportedly almost never washed, changed his clothes infrequently, and as a result, smelled absolutely terrible. Contemporary accounts describe James's odor in terms that are both vivid and nauseating. He smelled of body odor, obviously, but also of old food, because he ate messily, of wine, because he drank heavily, of urine, because personal toilet habits were apparently not a priority. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths when near the king. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the stench, but nobody could tell him directly because, well, he was the king. His appearance matched his smell. He didn't comb his hair regularly. His beard was often dirty. His clothes expensive. Elaborate royal garments were stained with food and drink. He had a habit of wiping his hands on his clothes while eating, which didn't help. And he wore the same outfits repeatedly without having them cleaned. Rich fabrics, elaborate embroidery, all slowly accumulating layers of grime and stink. James's personal habits extended beyond hygiene. He had very poor table manners, ate with his hands, even when utensils were provided, chewed with his mouth open, drank messily, with wine dribbling down his beard, belched loudly. All behaviors that would be considered disgusting for anyone, but were especially shocking for a king. Royalty was supposed to be refined, dignified. James was neither. He also had a habit of touching people, a lot, in ways that made courtiers deeply uncomfortable. He would paw at his male favorites, rest his hands on their shoulders or arms, touch their faces. This was partly about his rumored relationships with men. James almost certainly had romantic and possibly sexual relationships with several male courtiers, but it was also just about his complete lack of awareness of personal boundaries. He touched people because he wanted to, and nobody could stop him because he was king. His relationship with his wife, Anne of Denmark, was distant at best. They had children, 8 births, though only 3 survived to adulthoods, so clearly there was some physical relationship, but they lived apart much of the time. Anne developed her own court, her own interests, largely separate from James. Whether this was because of his hygiene issues, his male favorites, or just general incompatibility is unclear. Probably all 3. Anne herself was reasonably fastidious, bathed regularly, by the standards of the time, dressed well, maintained her appearance, which must have made the contrast with her husband even more striking. Here was the queen, trying to maintain dignity and decorum, while her husband smelled like a combination of a stable and a wine cellar. The courtiers developed coping strategies. They burned incense and perfumes constantly in the presence rooms to mask the smell. They stood upwind of the king when possible. They learned to keep conversations short so they wouldn't have to breathe his odor for too long. It became part of life at James's court, just another indignity you had to tolerate if you wanted royal favor. James also had digestive issues. Unsurprising, given his diet and drinking habits. He suffered from frequent upset stomachs, gas, diarrhea, and in an era with limited toilet facilities and even more limited understanding of privacy. This meant courtiers were often aware of the king's digestive distress, sometimes very directly aware, because James was not particularly discreet about bodily functions. His health deteriorated as he aged. By his 50s, he was suffering from arthritis, likely gout, kidney problems, and general physical decline. The lack of hygiene probably didn't help. Infections, skin conditions, dental problems, all exacerbated by his refusal to wash or maintain basic cleanliness. His teeth rotted, his skin developed sores. He looked and smelled like a dying man years before he actually died. He passed away in 1625, age 58, probably kidney failure, possibly stroke, definitely years of accumulated health problems. His son Charles I inherited the throne and immediately implemented stricter standards of personal hygiene at court. Charles was fastidious about cleanliness, bathed regularly, insisted courtiers do the same. It must have been a relief for everyone involved. But James's legacy wasn't just his smell. He commissioned the King James Bible, which remains influential. He managed to mostly keep England out of the 30 Years' War. He wrote treatises on theology and monarchy. He was actually quite intelligent and educated, despite his personal habits. But he's also remembered as the smelly king, the one who couldn't be bothered to wash, the one whose courtiers had to hold their breath. And here's the thing about royal privilege. James could be as disgusting as he wanted, and people still had to treat him with respect and deference. He could smell terrible, eat messily, touch people inappropriately, and there were no consequences, because he was king. His comfort and preferences mattered. Everyone else's comfort, their need for personal space, their desire not to be constantly assaulted by body odor, didn't matter at all. It's a reminder that royal life wasn't all glamour and luxury. If you were a courtier, you might have to spend hours per day in close proximity to a man who smelled like he'd been dead for a week. You might have to smile and bow and pretend everything was fine while trying not to gag. You might have to accept unwanted physical contact from someone whose hands were perpetually sticky with food residue and wine, all in the name of royal service. Before we drift into our final stories tonight, just a gentle reminder, you've enjoyed this journey through the unfortunate lives of European royalty. You might enjoy checking out the other videos on this channel. We have plenty more tales of dynastic disasters, genetic mishaps, and general royal misery to help you sleep. But for now, let's continue with a few more stories from history's most uncomfortable throne rooms. Let's drift to 19th century Austria now. Time to talk about Ferdinand I, who became emperor in 1835, despite being profoundly disabled and arguably unfit to rule. But he was the legitimate heir, so Austria got an emperor who had epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and an inability to comprehend complex political issues. And everyone just had to pretend this was fine. Ferdinand was born in 1793, eldest son of Francis II of Austria, and from birth it was clear something was wrong. He had an unusually large head, hydrocephalus, water on the brain. This caused seizures, developmental delays, and speech difficulties. As he grew, the problems persisted. He had frequent epileptic fits, struggled with basic cognition, could barely express himself verbally, was physically weak and uncoordinated. His father knew Ferdinand wasn't capable of ruling. Everyone knew, but the principle of primogeniture, eldest son inherits, was sacred. Austria couldn't just skip Ferdinand and give the throne to his younger, healthier brother. That would set a dangerous precedent, undermine the entire system of hereditary monarchy. So the decision was made. Ferdinand would be emperor, and other people would do the actual ruling for him. They prepared for this arrangement, set up a regency council, made plans for how to manage an empire with an incapacitated emperor. And in 1835, when Francis II died, Ferdinand became emperor, age 41. He'd lived his entire life in his father's shadow, everyone knowing he wasn't fit for the role he'd eventually have to fill. And now it was his. The reality of Ferdinand's reign was depressing. He could participate in ceremonies, be crowned, sit on thrones, appear at formal events, but he couldn't make decisions, couldn't understand the complex political issues facing Austria, couldn't engage in meaningful way with governance. His main contribution to council meetings was reportedly to say, "I am the emperor and I want dumplings," which tells you everything about his mental state and priorities. The actual ruling was done by a council led by Prince Metternich, the powerful chancellor who'd been running Austria for decades anyway. Metternich and the council made all real decisions. Ferdinand just signed documents he didn't understand and attended ceremonial functions. He was a figurehead, a symbol, not a ruler. And Ferdinand himself seems to have been aware, at least dimly, that he wasn't really in charge. He was reported to be frustrated, confused about why people asked him questions but didn't listen to his answers. He knew he was emperor, but didn't understand what that meant, or why he couldn't just have his dumplings in peace. It must have been bewildering, frightening even. He married in 1831, before becoming emperor, Maria Anna of Savoy, a political match. Obviously, Maria Anna was patient with Ferdinand, by all accounts, kind, but there were no children, couldn't be. Ferdinand's disabilities made him almost certainly infertile, and even if not, the physical act of conception was probably beyond him, so the marriage was childless. Maria Anna played the role of empress, supported her husband as best she could, but there was no heir. This meant the succession would pass to Ferdinand's younger brother when he died, which was fine, strategically, but it also highlighted the pointlessness of Ferdinand's reign. He was emperor, but not really, had a wife, but no heir, participated in governance, but didn't govern. His entire existence as emperor was symbolic. Then 1848 happened, the year of revolutions, uprisings across Europe. Austria was hit particularly hard. Vienna had riots, Metternich was forced to flee. The empire was in chaos, and Ferdinand, the disabled emperor who couldn't understand what was happening, was caught in the middle of it all. Terrified, confused, completely unable to respond to the crisis. The imperial family fled Vienna, moved from place to place, trying to avoid the revolutionaries. And during this chaos, it was decided that Ferdinand needed to abdicate. The empire needed strong leadership, needed someone who could actually make decisions and respond to crises. Ferdinand couldn't do that, had never been able to do that. So in December 1848, he was pressured to abdicate in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph. Ferdinand agreed, or rather, he signed the abdication documents that were put in front of him. Whether he fully understood what was happening is unclear, but at age 55, his reign was over, 18 years as emperor, and his main achievement was surviving, not causing any major disasters through his incapacity, letting other people run the empire while he attended ceremonies and asked for dumplings. He lived another 17 years in retirement, stayed in Prague, mostly, out of the public eye. His nephew Franz Joseph was now emperor. Ferdinand was yesterday's news, an embarrassing reminder of the problems with hereditary monarchy. He died in 1875, age 82, had outlived most of his contemporaries, had watched his nephew rule Austria through war and reform and modernization, had lived long enough to see that maybe, just maybe, Austria would have been better off if they'd skipped him and gone straight to Franz Joseph. But they couldn't do that. The rules of succession were too important. The principle of hereditary right was too sacred. So Austria got an emperor who couldn't rule for 18 years, and everyone pretended it was fine. Pretended Ferdinand was leading when he was clearly just a figurehead. Maintained the fiction of his authority while actual power was exercised by others. It was cruel, in a way. Cruel to Ferdinand, who was thrust into a role he couldn't fulfill. Cruel to Austria, which deserved better leadership during a turbulent period. But mostly it was just sad. Ferdinand never chose to be emperor, never asked for the responsibility. He was born into it, born disabled, and then forced to play a role for which he was manifestly unsuited, all because the rules said the eldest son inherits, regardless of capability. His story is a perfect example of everything wrong with absolute hereditary monarchy, the system that said it didn't matter if you were intelligent, capable, or even conscious if you were the eldest legitimate son. You inherited. Competence was optional. Disability was no obstacle. The bloodline was everything, and so Austria got Emperor Ferdinand I, who wanted dumplings and got an empire instead. Let's move to early 18th century England now. Time to talk about Queen Anne, whose reign was marked by military success abroad and physical agony at home. Anne had 17 pregnancies. None of her children survived to adulthood. She ended her reign obese, in constant pain, barely able to walk, and deeply depressed. And we'll drift through her story slowly, because it's relentlessly sad. Anne was born in 1665, daughter of James II, not expected to be queen. She had an older sister, Mary, but through a combination of political upheaval and tragic deaths, and ended up inheriting the throne in 1702. She was 37 and already in poor health, already mourning multiple dead children, already suffering from chronic pain. The pregnancies had started in 1684, shortly after her marriage to Prince George of Denmark. Anne was 19, healthy enough, though perhaps already showing signs of the gout that would eventually cripple her. The first pregnancy ended in stillbirth. Then she had a daughter, Mary, who lived 2 years before dying of smallpox. Then Anne miscarried, then had another stillbirth. then a daughter who died within hours, then a son who lived 11 years longer than any other before, dying of fever in 17 pregnancies in 16 years. Some ended in miscarriage, some in stillbirth, some produced babies who lived hours, days, or months before dying. Only one, William, Duke of Gloucester, survived past infancy, and he died at age 11, probably from smallpox or pneumonia. By 1700, Anne had no living children, had endured pregnancy after pregnancy, birth after birth, funeral after funeral, and had nothing to show for it except trauma and declining health. The physical toll was immense. 17 pregnancies destroyed her body. She developed complications, infections, chronic pain. Her health never recovered. By her late 30s, she was suffering from severe gout in her legs and feet, could barely walk, had to be carried in a chair for most official functions. The pain was constant and excruciating. She also gained weight, a lot of weight, partly from being immobilized by pain and gout, partly from comfort eating, probably. She loved food and drink, used them to cope with depression and grief. By her 40s, she was obese, so large that her coffin had to be nearly square. Courtiers documented her size in ways that were both pitying and cruel. She was the fat queen, the one who could barely move, who ate too much and drank too much and was always in pain. Her husband, Prince George, was reportedly supportive, dull, unambitious, but kind to an. They seemed to have genuinely cared for each other, which was unusual for a royal marriage. He was one of the few constants in her life, and then, in 1708, he died. Anne was devastated, lost her husband, the father of all those dead children, the one person who'd been consistently present through all the tragedy. She mourned deeply, intensely. Her health declined further. She continued ruling, despite everything. Made decisions about wars. The War of Spanish Succession was happening, and Britain was doing well militarily. She dealt with political factions, with Parliament, with the endless demands of governance. But she was in constant pain, constantly grieving, constantly exhausted, and she had no heir, no children. The succession was going to pass to distant German relatives from the House of Hanover when she died. Her final years were marked by political squabbling and increasing isolation. She favored certain courtiers, then turned against them, made decisions that were criticized as impulsive or poorly thought through. Her judgment was questioned. Whether this was due to pain, depression, or just the exhaustion of ruling while suffering is hard to say, probably all three. By 1714, she was clearly dying. The gout had spread. She had dropsy fluid retention, probably heart failure. She was massive, immobile, and in agonizing pain. She couldn't walk at all anymore, could barely move, spent her days in a chair, being carried from room to room, trying to continue ruling even as her body failed completely. She died on August 1st, 1714, age 49. Cause of death was probably stroke, though her health had been deteriorating for years. She'd reigned for 12 years. In that time, she'd presided over military victories, the acts of union that created Great Britain, significant political and cultural developments. But she'd also suffered constantly, mourned constantly, lived in pain and grief and isolation. Her funeral was elaborate, state ceremony, all the pomp and grandeur royalty demanded, but her legacy was complicated. She'd produced no heir, despite 17 attempts. The crown passed to George I of Hanover, a distant relative who barely spoke English. The Stuart line, which she represented, effectively ended with her. All those pregnancies, all that suffering, and it achieved nothing dynamic. Anne's story is a reminder of the brutal physical cost of royal duty for women. She was expected to produce heirs. Her primary job as queen and as wife was to have children, preferably sons. And she tried, 17 times. Her body was destroyed in the process, and she still failed, by the only metric that mattered to the system. No surviving children, no heir, no dynastic continuity. The cruelty of it is staggering. A woman who endured 17 pregnancies, multiple stillbirths, the deaths of every child she managed to birth, chronic pain and disability, obesity and social judgment, depression and grief, who kept trying to fulfill her duty even as her body broke down, who ruled competently despite constant suffering, and who was ultimately judged a failure because she produced no heir. Modern medicine probably could have helped her, could have determined why her pregnancies kept failing, genetic issues, immune problems, infections, could have treated her gout, her pain, her obesity, could have given her a quality of life that wasn't defined by constant physical agony. But in the early 18th century, there was nothing, just repeated pregnancies, repeated failures, repeated grief, until her body gave out entirely at 49. And so we drift toward the end of our journey through royal misery tonight. Just a few more stories before we let you slip into sleep. Before we finish, let's circle back to food one more time, because eating, even for the powerful, was often its own kind of torture. Let's talk about William the Conqueror. Yes, that William, the one who conquered England in 1066, powerful, successful, feared, and toward the end of his life, desperately trying to lose weight through methods that were both absurd and ineffective. William was born around 1028, became Duke of Normandy as a child, spent decades consolidating power, fighting rivals, building his reputation as a formidable military leader, and eating well, very well, rich food, lots of meat, plenty of wine, the diet of a successful medieval nobleman. By his 50s, William was fat, not just overweight, genuinely obese. His belly was so large he couldn't mount a horse easily, couldn't move quickly in armor, was mocked by enemies for his size. King Philip I of France allegedly asked when William was going to give birth, which was both cruel and effective as medieval insults go. William, who'd built his reputation on military prowess, was now too fat to function as a warrior. So he decided to diet. His solution: stop eating solid food entirely, consume only alcohol. William's weight loss plan was to replace meals with wine, just drink instead of eating, which is perhaps the most medieval diet plan imaginable. Ignore nutrition entirely. Substitute calories from food with calories from fermented grape juice. Hope for the best. Shockingly, this didn't work. William did lose some weight, apparently, but he also became drunk constantly. His judgment suffered, his health declined. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and intoxicated most of the time. Not ideal for someone trying to rule Normandy and England, but he persisted, because vanity and military pride demanded he reduce his gut. In 1087, William was campaigning in France. He'd regained enough fitness to mount a horse, barely. Was riding through a burned town when his horse stumbled. William was thrown forward. His enormous belly hit the iron pommel of his saddle. The impact ruptured something internal, probably his intestines or bladder. He was badly injured. In agony they carried him to Rouen, put him to bed, called physicians. But internal injuries in 1087 were untreatable. They couldn't diagnose exactly what was wrong, couldn't operate, couldn't do anything except watch him die slowly over several weeks. The infection spread. The pain intensified. William the Conqueror, one of the most powerful men in Europe, died in agony because he was too fat to properly absorb a fall from a horse. His death created immediate problems. His body was so large and so swollen from infection that it would unfit in the stone sarcophagus prepared for him. His attendants tried to force the corpse in. Something ruptured, probably the infected abdominal cavity. The smell was so horrific that everyone fled the church. The funeral had to be abandoned. Eventually, they managed to squeeze him in and seal the sarcophagus, but only after one of the most undignified burial attempts in royal history. William's story ends with the image of his corpse, too fat to fit in its tomb, rupturing and clearing a church with its stench. A powerful king reduced to an object of disgust, and the cause was straightforward: decades of rich eating, followed by an absurd crash diet that weakened him without actually solving the problem, followed by an injury his weight made fatal. The lesson, if there is one, is that even conquerors are subject to their bodies. William could defeat armies, could invade and conquer England, could rule 2 territories and fight off rivals for decades, but he couldn't defeat his appetite or his expanding waistline. And in the end, his obesity contributed directly to his death, and made his burial a grotesque farce. Well then, we've drifted through Templar meal schedules, Habsburg genetics, imprisoned queens, neglected princes, smelly kings, disabled emperors, grieving queens, and obese conquerors. We've toured centuries of royal misery, dysfunction, and biological disaster, all of it historically accurate, all of it thoroughly depressing. If you made it this far, you either a sleep which was the goal, or you developed a deep appreciation for how unpleasant it was to be royal. Either way, thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. There are plenty more stories like these in the archive, more dynasties, more disasters, more proof that being born into power didn't save you from suffering, often made it worse. Sleep well, and be grateful you weren't born into the Spanish Habsburg line, or any line, really. Modern life has its problems, but at least your family tree probably branches. Good night.